Hello everyone, I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. This lecture is part of the ongoing series on Indian writing in English and also Indian writing in English translation. And the lecture is titled Mamang Dai, Two Poems. Now, I'm sure that those of you who are, somewhat familiar with writing from the northeast of India would have come across, works of Mamang Dai. And, so when we think about India's northeast, literature from different states come to mind. There are writers from Manipur, Nagaland, Assam, also even Arunachal. So while there are certain common links between the among the experiences of people across these states, but at the same time there is immense amount of uniqueness as well in their culture, in their experience, and also in the way they represent their lives as well. Right. So this is something that we need to understand when we approach any writer from the northeast. In fact, there is another concern that is a lot of times raised, that the term writing from the northeast also seems to be a blanket term, right, which sometimes seems to obscure these unique facets of experience and representation in the works of all these writers from the different countries, from the different states. So we need to be aware of these questions while approaching literature from the region. While of course one can spend an entire lecture discussing about these debates, but today's lecture is particularly focused on a poet and a writer from Arunachal Pradesh, and she is called Mamang Dai. So she is a contemporary writer born in 1957, and she is also a poet, a novelist, and a journalist, right? Who's not only from Arunachal, but she's also based in Arunachal Pradesh, right? So we see that how she writes in different forms. So she has written poetry, she has written fiction, and we also come across some of the works by her that deal with the oral folklore as well, right? As we know that how orality is a very, very important part of the culture of a lot of states in India's northeast. Now, just to understand, where is this writer coming from? We see that how she and her works actually got recognition on a lot of platforms. She even received the Sahitya Academy Award in 2017 for her novel The Black Hill, and she also received a Padma Shri in 2011. And the government of Arunachal Pradesh also conferred upon her the annual Warrior Elvin Prize in 2013 for her book Arunachal Pradesh, The Hidden Land. So you see, the Warrior Elvin Prize is actually named after a very important thinker, who's written about the narratives and experience of the tribals and their culture as well. So if anybody is interested in understanding this aspect of these writings, then Warrior Elvin is a very, very important source to go to. He's written about Nagaland and likewise various other tribes as well, and throws light on the question of representing tribal experience in literature. Now you see, as I just now said, that Mamang Dai is a prolific writer who has authored books of fiction, poetry collections, and also some of the non-fictional illustrated folklore texts as well. So some of these include, the first one is Arunachal Pradesh, The Hidden Land, 2003. Mountain Harvest, The Food of Arunachal, 2004, The Sky Queen and Once Upon a Moon Time in 2003. Now you see, what we understand is that if you just look at the titles of all these books, very clearly the author is trying to represent the region where she comes from. And I'm sure that you're aware of the fact that how for a long time, and even in fact to an extent till date, there is a certain sense of misrepresentation, or I would say even underrepresentation of experience from the region, right? So the writers over there are very consciously right against these biases that have been perpetuating in the fields of culture and in other domains as well. So we notice that how the poets, the writers, from different states of India's northeast, they not only discuss their history, there are immense references to their history, references to culture, and of course even folklore in the cases where it's applicable. So you see, all these titles of the non-fictional works by Mamang Dai that we noticed appear to tell us, I mean, they actually tell us that how the author is attempting to bring out the lived experience in the region. And then one might ask that, why is that the case? Why should a set of writers do that? As just a while ago I mentioned that all these endeavors are the means adopted by some of the writers to rewrite the discourses prevalent about a certain people, to also contest certain opinions that may not be fully developed about the people in the region. So you see, that is what that is why it becomes important for these writers to write about the reality of their region, and also write about it in as diverse means as possible. So therefore we see that how Mamang Dai resorts to poetry, non-fiction and even fiction in order to make her point, right? So on screen you see Mamang Dai. This is an image taken from the Arunachal Times, and so we see that how she's a contemporary writer who was born in the late 50s and is still around, right? Now if we just very quickly take a look at, we've seen some of her, we've at least acquainted ourselves with some of the texts of non-fiction written by her, that are texts of folklore. And now these are we'll look at some of the works of fiction by her. So one of her first novels was published in 2006, and it's called The Legends of Pensam. I'm sure that those of you who are aware with literature from the region would have heard of this text even before, because it's one of the very popular ones written by Mamang Dai. Then in 2008 she wrote the novel Stupid Cupid, The Black Hill in 2014, for which she was also awarded the Sahitya Academy Award, and Escaping the Land in 2021. So you see, we notice that how this is one of the fairly recent works of fiction that we've noticed here. Right now, finally coming to poetry, because that's where our focus is going to be today. Her poetry collections include the River Poems in 2004, The Balm of Time in 2008, Humbril Mai's Loom which was published in 2014, Midsummer Survival Lyrics in 2014, The Balm of Time once again, which was also published in Assamese, is also another one of her works belong to her poetry collections. Now you see, we notice that how there is a very distinct element of nature in her poems, and even the title of a lot of these collections indicate that: The Balm of Time, the River Poems, Midsummer Survival Lyrics, right? So we see that how closeness to nature is an essential aspect of experience of people in the region. And At the same time, this coexists with another important concern, that is, the concern with the pressing questions of the times. So you see, one thing that we will notice in most of the literary voices from the region is that they are very, very, I would say, sharp in their observation about the different concerns in society, right? So you will notice that somewhere or the other, there is a perspective shared by the author in about one concern or the other. So even as we said that that the nature plays an important part, Mamang Dai focuses on the folklore of the region. She attempts to represent. She actually represents different aspects of life in Arunachal, but at the same time, there are some questions also which are raised through her works. Now, what are these questions? We're going to look at some of those as we discuss, the texts written by her. But before we go on to discussing, the two poems that is the agenda for today, let us also understand, look at the view of his very famous literary critic Tilottama Mishra, who talks about the language of the writers, from Arunachal, and what role it plays in the representation of various themes. So you see, this is a quote from Tilottama Mishra's very famous essay, Crossing Linguistic Boundaries, right? And here she says, and I quote, the writers from Arunachal Pradesh have crossed the linguistic barriers decisively in order to create a literature of their own. Their fictional works can claim a double parentage and are twice born, which is to borrow a term from Meenakshi Mukherjee, in the true sense of the term, because they belong both to the tradition of Arunachali literature as well as to the literatures of the native speakers of languages which they have chosen to make the vehicles of their own thoughts, unquote. So you see, there is a very important dimension that Mishra is highlighting here. So she is talking about Arunachali literature as being written in languages which may not necessarily be the native language of the region. So a lot of times, as she says, that the creative literature finds its source or find its medium in language of certain other region. So but the point that's being made is that these languages that are adopted by the writers, therefore the reason for doing this is, as she says, to cross the linguistic barriers, right? Because you see, there are so many languages, so many native languages spoken by people in Arunachal. Every ethnic group, every community has their own different language. But then, how, and this is a concern which is common to a lot of regions, not only in India but even across the globe as well, that which language is to be chosen in order to highlight in order to ensure that it reaches the widest possible audience, right? So with this in mind, that's the reason why Tilottama Mishra discusses about the linguistic barriers. So she says that the writers have actually crossed the linguistic barriers by adopting language which then is used, or is a language that is understood not just by their own people but even people outside. So that's why they say that their fictional works can claim a double parentage, right? That is, they belong to the tradition of Arunachal literature, that is of Arunachali literature, that is sure, that no matter the language used by these writers, but the works that they produce are very much considered to be part of Arunachali literature. But at the same time, these works also belong to literatures of the native speakers of the languages which have been adopted by these writers to represent their thoughts. So you see how the works written by writers from the region therefore have these two affiliations then, so to say, right. So this is an important aspect for us to remember when we approach the writers and their works in the region. And the next point that she also makes in the same essay is also where she talks about the relevance of regional languages. And this is what she says, and I quote, "The regional languages in India today seem to be fighting a losing battle everywhere in the country, and the future of creative literature in these languages hangs in the balance." The two Arunachali writers, so she is talking about Mamang Dai and Dorje Thongchi, whose works had created a new tradition in Arunachali literature, have become representatives of a tragic generation of creative writers whose works are no longer read by their own people because they are written in a language that is not quote unquote useful to the new generation, unquote. So you see, now this is another crisis that Tilottama Mishra points to, that's confronting the literature from the region, that how the regional languages therefore seem to be somewhat struggling to survive, because most of the people have now chosen to adopt languages which are more widely understood. They are being educated or schooled in those languages, and they are using those languages more and more, such as, of course, English is one. And with that, the regional languages then take a back seat. So this is another I would say a question plaguing the writings from the region, right. So now, having understood a few of these concerns, let us go on to discuss the first poem by our poet Mamang Dai, and it's called An Obscure Place. Now you see, this particular poem is important for us to understand that how the poet engages with the culture, the history of their region and the people, and uses the creative mode to voice certain opinions about the same, right. So let's see how Mamang Dai brings these concerns through her poetry. An Obscure Place. The history of our race begins with the place of stories. We do not know if the language we speak belongs to a written past. Nothing is certain. So you see, in the very first stanza of the poem itself, she is pointing to some of the important aspects of their culture. First of all, she says that the history of our race begins with the place of stories. Again, highlighting what? That how orality is an important aspect of experience and literature in Arunachal Pradesh. And then she says that we do not know if language we speak belongs to a written past. Now, once again, she is raising a question about the language used by the people in the region. So she says that I don't know if it belongs to a written past, or whether the history that we have, is it only to be found in oral narratives, or are there written accounts as well? She says nothing is certain. So question about language, question about history, and question about orality. These three concerns are introduced right at the outset, right. So thereon she goes on and says that there are mountains. Oh, there are mountains. We climbed every slope. We slept by the river, but do not speak of victory yet. Now, in this second stanza, she is emphasizing the centrality of nature to their experience. There are mountains, she says. So, and then there is a repetition there, which highlights that there is too many of them, right. So, we all know that how Arunachal is also a very famous hill town for travelers to visit, right? So mountains are very much a part of their daily life and landscape. And she said that we climbed every slope. So we can say that while on the one hand, the word mountains, at a literal level, points towards the abundance of nature. At another level, we can say that the word mountains also operates symbolically as a symbol, maybe a symbol of challenges, a symbol of questions confronting them. And she says, so we climbed every slope. So which means that we confronted all these challenges with courage or with bravery. We slept by the river, so highlighting the closeness with nature, but do not speak of victory yet. So again, mentioning that how the process is ongoing of addressing different concerns which are native to the place. And she goes on to say, an obscure place haunts the hunter. The prize slips away. Yesterday, the women hid their faces. They forbade their children to speak. Yesterday, we gave shelter to men who climbed over our hills for glory of a homeland. They said, those who know what knowing is. And now, the sleeping houses, the men and the villages have turned to stone. Right. So let's look at these sentences right away. So she says, an obscure place haunts the hunter. Right. And yesterday, the women hid their faces. They forbade their children to speak. Now, these two lines highlight a sense of fear. They talk about maybe they actually hint at an atmosphere where they're not able to express themselves entirely freely, right? Now, what are the concerns or what are the reasons for this kind of lack of freedom to speak or their inability to conduct themselves the way they wish is not very clearly mentioned by the poet. But we understand that how apprehension and fear are actually important aspects of the region, even though we are aware that how Arunachal Pradesh as compared to all other states in the northeast is fairly peaceful, right? And then she goes on to say, yesterday we gave shelter to men who climbed over our hills for a glory of a homeland. They said, those who know what knowing is, and now the sleeping houses, the men in the villages have turned to stone. Now she is talking about giving shelter to men who climbed over our hills. So you see the mention our hills and men very clearly brings out a contrast, that the people that have come are not the natives of the land, but they give them shelter, because these people have come for glory of a homeland, right? Once again, they are those who know what knowing is, and now the sleeping houses, the men and the villagers have turned to stone. So having given them a refuge, she says that the house and the houses and the people have turned to stone. Stone, once again, maybe lacking life, lacking vitality, etc. Then she says, if there is no death, the news is silent. If there is only silence, we should be disturbed. Listen, the tone of a prayer is hushed. If a stranger passes this way, let him look up to the sky. So here again she's raising some very important concerns which are there in culture about the silence in the news, about the silence of the people, and also the attitude that must be there of the strangers towards the natives of the land, right? So in fact, this is an important stanza which requires a detailed explanation, and we will carry that forward in the next part of the lecture. But just to do a very quick recap, so in this lecture we understood about Mamang Dai, her background. We introduced the author as an author from India's northeast, certain questions which are linguistic, cultural in concern. We also talked about those, and we need to keep in mind certain debates which continue to be relevant when we approach the literature from the region, right? And thereafter we discuss that how Arunachal Pradesh and the literature from the region has had a difficult trajectory vis-a-vis language, because the regional languages did not really find a lot of traction, and they kept borrowing. They express themselves. The writers express themselves in borrowed languages, and thereby belonging to two different traditions simultaneously. One is a tradition of Arunachali literature, and second, they also are part of the tradition of literature, of the language that they've adopted, right? So these are some of the concerns that we highlighted in this lecture, and we also started discussing an important poem by Mamang Dai, and this discussion we will take it forward in the next part of the lecture. Thank you.